Welcome to the Frictionless Innkeeper podcast. Coming right up, fresh tips and insights from lodging professionals aimed at helping you improve your business. Our podcast is brought to you by the Frictionless Guest App, the digital concierge that helps your guests to live like locals. Learn how at frictionlessguest.com.
Steve Short, my friend, how are you?
I'm doing well, Matt. How are you?
Doing well. We had a podcast interview right now with Marilyn Bushnell and Chuck Anderson of Marilyn Bushnell and Associates. And we interviewed Marilyn, 4 years ago in 2000, and it was great to catch up with her. We've never spoke with Chuck before, and lots of great insights here on how to enhance the value of your property.
Yeah, I mean, they're both former innkeepers, so they've been in the business. They know the business from that side of things. And I know Marilyn's been doing brokering for a long time since she hasn't owned her inn. And then Chuck, I guess, is a entrepreneurial business kind of a guy who owned an inn and then ended up selling it not too long ago and has gotten into the brokering since then. So yeah, I mean, definitely they've got the background. And I think this was cool as far as, innkeepers need to always kind of think about the future, even if they have no exit plan or strategy or whatever. I mean, that's the whole point that I got out of this. What I took out of this was that, and really this applies to any business, is you need to manage things from the beginning as best as you can and be aware of certain things that are very important that ultimately are going to help the business while you have it, but also enhance the value of the business when it is time for you to get out of that business. And there's always going to be that time, whether it's, in the near future or not. So do those things now and you'll be happy later on, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chuck really went into a lot of great details about specific things that innkeepers can do, as soon as they buy a property and kind of all the way through to enhance the value. And with that in mind, we hope you enjoy this Frictionless Innkeeper podcast interview with Marilyn Bushnell and Chuck Anderson of Marilyn Bushnell and Associates. All right. And welcome, Marilyn, and welcome, Chuck. And of course, welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
Hey, Matt.
Great to have you both. Steve Short, how are you?
I'm fine, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Great.
Thank you, Marilyn and Chuck, for being here.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Marilyn, it's actually been about 4 years since we did our last podcast, so it's great to have you back. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it was back in COVID days. Whoo.
Yeah, exactly. So, let's go ahead and kick this one off. So, if you don't mind, tell us about the background of Marilyn Bushnell and Associates, and maybe we'll start with Marilyn, and then Chuck, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Great. Thank you, sir. Well, I am the Marilyn Bushnell as part of our business. Chuck and I work together as partners in this business of brokerage. So we're helping buyers, we call them aspiring innkeepers, and sellers of inns transitioning in and out of this business. It's great to always work with either side so that we can really see this industry flourish in the future.
So Marilyn invited me to join her a couple of years ago when she pretty much went on her own as a broker, independent broker. And I started out just working on the numbers, have kind of transitioned into being a full partner in the business for working with both buyers and sellers all over the country to help folks who want to become owners of a bed and breakfast or a boutique lodging property, or those that are ready to move on to something different and want to find new stewards for the business that they've built.
And talk a little bit about your background, because you have both your former innkeepers, which is hugely important, I'd say, for what you do now. Talk a little bit about how many years in the industry and that sort of thing.
It is, Steve. I bought my inn in Pennsylvania. It was an 18-room inn with my husband, who has passed away. And we ran our inn for about 10 years prior to selling. I call myself a classic innkeeper because I haven't really had to deal with a lot of the different aspects that I'll say, modern innkeepers had to deal with. And that's a lot of technology that they deal with much more so today. but I owned my inn for 10 years. It was a select registry inn, sold the inn. It made it very successful and got into brokerage in 2005. And I've been helping buyers and sellers of inns since that time. I cut my teeth in the residential brokerage world so I could get some really quick and fast experience as a broker, and attained my license as a broker in Pennsylvania and in Maryland. However, I consult on marketing and selling inns and transitioning those inns in all other states as well. Chuck, you came in right after COVID, I would say.
Yeah, Marilyn and Scott were actually the brokers that sold us or helped us buy Lucille's Mountaintop Inn and Spa in Northeast Georgia in 2015. And when we bought the inn, we had a 5 to 7 year business plan. Our plan was to come in and run it for, like I said, 5 to 7 years, and then move on to other things. And at about year 4.5 or year 5, we ran the numbers on how the inn was doing and were pleasantly surprised. So we went ahead and put the inn on the market in the fall of 2019. And we actually had 2 offers in hand and accepted one right as COVID hit and shut us down. Fortunately, we were in a good place business-wise and were able to complete that transaction in June of 2020. And the new owner is still running the place and doing quite well. And Charlie, my wife, and I wandered around as digital nomads for a couple of years and finally ended up about 10 minutes away from where the inn was because it felt so much like home here in the Northeast Georgia mountains. And about 2.5 years ago, during that wandering time, Marilyn called me up and asked if I would help run some of the numbers for the brokerage stuff, because I spent about 25 years in the tech industry and then had a couple of other entrepreneurial engagements. And before I bought my inn, and then when I ran my inn, I treated it very much like a business startup from a numbers perspective. And even though it wasn't a startup, it was a very well-established in business. But when we sold it, we had increased the revenue by about 50% and also almost doubled the overall value of the business. So that's kind of the focus that I brought into Marilyn Bushnell and Associates. And that's where my favorite 3 letters are ROI, which is return on investment. Anytime anybody has a conversation with me about numbers, that's one of the things we'll be talking about.
And that was
Good
one
deal.
of the reasons that I reached out to Chuck. I knew how good he was in running his inn, and it was very much a part of something we look at within our business. So he was valuable to me in that way.
Good deal. Cool. So how are things out there? What's the current environment like in terms of innkeeping and buying, selling? I mean, COVID certainly shook up a lot of things. And I think there's ongoing concern. Well, from my personal perspective, I'm always concerned with really, I guess, the preservation side of innkeeping and the desire to still have bed and breakfasts and cool places to go to. And I know they'll always be there, but how have things shifted? You know, you hear about places being bought and either converted into Airbnb type situations or private residences, which again, at least it's preserved, but there's also that part of me that says the B&B thing is really unique, really cool. And I want to be able to still go to those places. So how are things out there right now?
Absolutely. Well, from the standpoint of demand, there are still buyers. There are buyers who are always, as I say, dreaming that dream. And I don't believe that will ever go away. We still get those phone calls. They may be pipe dreams for some because they don't have potentially enough information or skills or funds to move forward. But we have numerous individuals who are still dreaming that dream. And I believe that's going to continue for the future, Steve. In terms of the inns have seen some, challenges, I'd say, the past couple of years. They certainly had to go through a heck of a time with COVID. Then many of them got a nice bump in their business, depending on where they were. And that was very critical in their business right at in that 21, 22 timeframe. Well, then other parts of the traveling market opened up and the inn started to see a dip in those numbers. Those numbers were not there to stay. So they are becoming a bit more normalized and in some ways a little concerning to the inns because they were hopefully relying on those increased numbers. So we do see a variety. And again, that depends on location driven. The urban inns probably suffered the longest and are just starting to see them go up a little bit more. The rural inns had that big bump and are starting to see some dips that they're learning how to make some changes. Chuck, you want to add some thoughts there?
Yeah, I say that sellers are still definitely out there for inns, but their expectations for how much their businesses and their properties are worth have gone up a good bit. A lot of that's driven by the run up in real estate prices. There's a lot of folks that seem to think that their real estate is worth 50% more now than it was 5 years ago. And there are some markets where that's still true, but for many markets, it's a little unrealistic. And then on the flip side, buyers are still wanting to get in to buy inns, like Marilyn mentioned. But with the rise in interest rates and some of the other things that are happening in the financial markets, it's become a bit more difficult to get financing. So one of the unpleasant tasks we have sometimes is telling people that, hey, you need to have at least 30% of the asking price of the property that you're looking at in order to qualify to buy the place. And that's a lot of money when so many businesses and real estate values have gone up so significantly. Like Marilyn mentioned, 21 and 22 were effectively what I call unicorn years for the B&B industry. I mean, it was like the internet boom almost in the bed and breakfast industry. And things have normalized now. They haven't dropped off a cliff, but they have certainly flattened out in terms of revenue expectations.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess our main topic that we want to get into is whether, I guess it's really geared more toward existing innkeepers. And that is, you've got a whole lot of ideas on how to really look at the idea of enhancing your property's value, an overall business strategy perspective, right? And so really we're talking about whether you're getting ready to purchase an inn, whether you've just purchased an inn or you've had it for a long time, whatever, not really from an exit strategy perspective, but I guess from the perspective that everybody's going to exit at some point. Chuck said 5 to 7 years, that was their timeline, right? So whether you have a timeline or not, it's always good business to do things and do certain things right from the very beginning if you can. If not, start doing it now, I guess, right? So you want to talk a little bit about your ideas on that, on enhancing property value?
Yeah, I think that was an important point, Steve. Really starting now, and now by meaning when you purchase your inn or develop your inn if you've created it. So often we go into an inn, and it may be during a time when they're considering their exit strategy, and they have just not been prepared. They may have run their inn at their own personal lifestyle, meaning they're shutting the business down for longer periods of time so they can take time off or do what they personally want to do. And so we will see potentially an inconsistent business. And what we want to see is how that inn can run as a full business if all of the lights are turned on, on a full-time basis. So we really go in and look at a property and understand where it is today, but then also what could it be doing? And we can't make judgments that are unrealistic in the marketplace that they may be in, but we do want to see what could be done here. So that's really some of the first things. So our first advice to any innkeeper when they are getting into this business is to run the inn as a business. And we recognize, again, Chuck and I come out of the innkeeping industry. I know what it's like to work 24 hours a day, literally. And it's a hard, physically hard, and sometimes emotionally hard business to manage. So you do need time off. You do need to get away. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but manage that. Know how to do that and know how to create a business around your own personal life as well. I respect those that do take that time off. Again, I think you do need to have that, but we want to see a business run a bit more effectively than we sometimes see. Chuck, you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on what Marilyn said about running a business effectively, that's really what's going to drive the value of your inn, of any business, but especially an inn, when it comes time to pass it off to somebody else. And what a lot of people get distracted by life and by running their business. And then when they reach that point emotionally and physically, and sometimes financially, where it's time to move on, it's like, okay, we got to do it now. And the issue that we often run into at that point, whether it's because of a health crisis or because, you've now got kids or grandkids that you want to spend more time with, whatever the reason may be, if you haven't planned for it ahead of time, then you're basically going to end up leaving money on the table. A bank is going to want to see, for a buyer to get a loan, at least 3 years of business records. And if you don't have good, clean finances for 3 years, then the only person or the only type of person you're going to really be able to sell your business to is somebody who has a whole lot of cash. And they're out there, but they're not going to be able to get a loan at 20 or 25% down payment. They're going to have to, if you don't have a really good revenue stream and numbers, not just profit and loss statements, but also tax returns to back that up, you're not going to be able to get top dollar for your property when you sell it. And that's one of the things we're happy to do with people, is to try to start that planning process a couple of years early. And also keep in mind that the normal time on the market for bed and breakfast or a small inn is 12 to 18 months. So it's not like a house in California where you're going to have 10 offers the first day you put it on the market. I mean, HGTV does a lot of shows about people turning houses around really quick. And they also do some shows about people trying to start lodging properties who don't pay attention to the laws and restrictions and what's all involved in that. And what you end up with is, frankly, sometimes it's an albatross that people feel like they've got hung around their neck. They want to sell their business, but they can't, at least not for what they think it's worth, because they haven't done their homework in strategic planning for the last 2 or 3 years to make it look like it's actually worth what it should be worth.
And Steve, let me just add a couple of other items. That financials, it's a critical area, but a couple of other items that they always should be looking at, whether they're ready to sell, but really a part of their business strategy. Condition. Condition adds good value to your property. It certainly will bring guests back, but good condition adds good value. From a exit strategy standpoint, we also want you to pay attention to your hidden rooms. That means your laundry room, your storage areas. How well are they maintained and managed? From a business standpoint, it makes for a much more efficient operation. From a selling standpoint, it is also going to add to the value and the overall perception. Owner's
One of the things
quarters.
that I like to talk to people about as well. And this is true whether you're in the beginning stages, the middle stages, or the end stages of your operation. What is the product that you're selling? It's not like, the TV ads where we'll leave the light on for you where you get a clean, comfortable room. What most bed and breakfast people or customers, guests are looking for is an experience. And that's really what you're selling. So how are you curating that experience and how are you presenting that to your market and to your guests and to the folks that might be interested in eventually buying your business? The other thing that I found more and more often, especially in today's market, where we actually are seeing a lot of people come into in ownership who are not doing this as a retirement plan. They're more in the what I would call a traditional midlife age groups in the 40s or in 50s. And they tend to be more business savvy. They also tend to be more focused on how they want to live their lives when they are bed and breakfast owners and innkeepers. And a lot of those folks are looking for properties that can run themselves for the most part, at least for a period of time. And by that, I mean, if it's just, a family operation, two folks that are working together to run a business and they do everything themselves, then the only way for them to get away is to shut down. This kind of ties into what Marilyn was talking about earlier. Whereas if those inns that have made the investment to hire staff and or form relationships with interim innkeepers who can come back and make sure that the guests are getting the same kind of experience that they're used to getting from the owner operators, those properties tend to sell a little bit faster and for a little bit more money because buyers recognize that they're not going to have to sell their souls in order to buy and run this place. There's a lot of romance to becoming an innkeeper. I used to get probably 2 or 3 conversations a month over breakfast with my guests about, they would say, well, this seems like a dream life. You fix breakfast for people and then enjoy your coffee on the deck looking
Dream
at
of the dream.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And my typical response is, well, until you get a guest call at 11 o'clock at night because their toilet stopped up or because their next door neighbor is watching The Walking Dead at too high of a volume or something like that, then it's not so idyllic. But if you have staff who can handle some of those 11 o'clock phone calls, it makes life a lot better for everybody. And honestly, at the end of the day, it goes back to that guest experience and gives the guest a better experience because a burned out innkeeper is going to show. I used to tell my staff when I was interviewing them, actually, that my goal was for my business was for everybody who walked in the front door, including employees, for their blood pressure to drop 10 points. And then I'd ask potential employees, how are you going to help me do that? And the way they answered that question went a long way in determining whether or not they got a job offer. Because some people get it and some people don't.
I'd like to add is maintenance, deferred maintenance. And what the other thing we are seeing is that if the deferred maintenance is not managed properly, when it comes to the transition time, insurance plays such a huge role. You've probably had that as a topic somewhere along the way in the podcast. Insurance is becoming more and more challenging these days, and not just in states where weather might play a bigger factor. Overall, the insurance companies are watching what the property looks like. Is it up to code? Are there issues that might be a problem or a source in transition? So you want to manage that maintenance on your property throughout, because again, it is part of the guest experience, even though sometimes it may be hidden, but it also affects how it gets transitioned as well.
Interesting you say that because Matt and I were just talking this morning how we haven't had anybody on about insurance on the podcast, and we were talking about some possible candidates. So it sounds like, I mean, there's two parts of this because I realized when we said in the intro that, enhancing the value of your property really, and it's an overall business strategy, really what we need to say is you're enhancing the value of the business. And the business, there's the physical aspect of the property itself, which is the biggest asset probably, or one of the biggest assets. And that's hugely important for the current running of the business, because if the property's run down, then people are less willing, the experience is crappy, right?
Correct.
And then what you're saying, Marilyn, part of that physical property is also there are hidden parts of that the guest doesn't see, that doesn't play into the guest experience. Some of that's important. And then there's also the reality of the maintenance stuff that partly might be seen as part of the guest experience, but not necessarily either. And so you really have to look at, I mean, it kind of comes down to anything else, home, business, or the fact that this is kind of a combination of, real property and business property. If you run the business right, that means that you keep things maintained and you keep things looking good for your guests, but you also provide a good experience. You get good reviews. All of these things go into the overall value of that business. And you can separate them out, but you really shouldn't neglect any of them, right?
Absolutely. It's a juggle. It's absolutely a juggle. And I know that an innkeeper has to look at their 24-hour day and figure out where I spend my time. What's most important right now? And sometimes it's staring you smack in the face, but other times you need to take care of those longer range issues as well and do some proper planning.
Yeah. And Chuck being the ROI guy,
System level thinking. You have to look at the whole system,
right?
And how all the different parts play with each other.
Yeah. What I was going to ask Chuck is ROI, return on investment. There's time investment and money investment. So how would you suggest, I mean, and maybe you've got some parameters that you could suggest to existing innkeepers as to what kind of parameters, numbers should they be focusing on? Meaning, like, for example, you improve the marketing, you want more heads in beds, you want your booking rates, whatever.
You want ADR and occupancy, absolutely, to be strong.
Right.
Yeah.
But the number one most important number really is NOI, net operating income. I've seen lots of, I'll just use myself as an example because I like doing that. I had certain months of the year in my business where I ran 90% occupancy during the busy times, the busy seasons. And that was just too much. It was too much wear and tear on me, on my staff, on my building. And so what I discovered was that if I raised my rates so that I could get occupancy down to, 65 or 70%, not only did I make more money, I enjoyed my life more. And the ADR and the occupancy, those numbers are very important. But if you spend all your money on employees and this is not exaggeration, it actually happens, on ski trips for your family as a board meeting, and I did air quotes for the board meeting, your accountant will allow you to do that, but that has an impact on your net operating income. And that has an impact on whether or not a buyer can get a loan, because the bank is going to look at the net operating income. That's the thing that they care about the very most in terms of whether or not the business can pay the mortgage for a new owner. And there are lots of different things you can do that will impact your net operating income. And keep in mind that a lender won't even look at things like what your mortgage looks like or what your salary looks like, but they are going to pay attention to how you structure your tax return in terms of, for example, paying yourself rent to cover the mortgage if you have a multi-business entity set up like most owners do. And if you've been doing it for a long time, we've run into this quite a few times in this past year, where people have been running their business for a very long time. So their mortgage payment is really low compared to the overall price and value of the inn. But because their accountant did exactly what they should be doing, which was to minimize their tax burden, the tax returns looked like the inn wasn't making enough money to pay a mortgage. And what we ended up having to do in those cases is counsel innkeepers to tell their CPAs, look, I know it's going to cost me more in taxes, but I want to sell this business in a couple of years. So what I really need to focus on is getting my net operating income number as strong as possible. And if that costs me some extra money in taxes because I'm paying myself a salary instead of rent, if it means I'm using capital expenditures for things like painting or putting in new heating and air systems, we need to make sure we document that correctly in the taxes and in the P&Ls so that when it comes time to sell in 2 or 3 years, that net operating income is as high as it could possibly be. Another really easy one is vehicle expenses. Most people with their B&Bs, they expense their vehicles. Perfectly legitimate from a perspective of the IRS, but it has an impact on your net operating income on your bottom line. And you have to decide upfront or when you're looking at moving on and transitioning your business to a new owner, you have to look at, okay, how do I make the most money that I can make on this transaction? And that means I have to show a profit, even if that means I'm paying extra taxes.
Do you think that are buyers savvy to see where you're cutting? I guess they're looking for 2 to 3 years. The banks are, lenders are, but also, anybody making that who's actually purchasing the business would also want to see at least that much of, financials and all that. So the net operating income thing, I'm thinking of the golden goose or whatever, that story where you run the business where you're not paying anything. You're trying to keep a minimum cost for those 2 to 3 years because it's obvious that you're trying to sell the business and making those numbers look better. But I guess that's going to catch up with you in terms of maintenance or whatever else. Other than just doing smart things, is there anything that you should maybe not do because it's going to look obvious that you're trying to jack the numbers up?
I would say go back to to what Marilyn said earlier. Maintain the property and maintain the business. I mean, go ahead and spend the money that you need to spend on marketing, spend the money you need to spend on updating your decor, for example, stay current with current trends. It's sad, but most visitors, guests nowadays, they really don't care about antiques, as one example. And I say that because a lot of inn owners will get a little wrapped around the axle about how much money and time and effort they spent in creating this beautiful environment for guests to come, and they want to get paid back for that when it comes time to sell. And a couch is a couch. I had a property that I was working with about a year and a half ago that is furnished with absolutely perfectly furnished with antiques. I mean, they did a really, really good job on it. But I was in the shop area out back and I said, "What's under that tarp there?" And the owner said, "Oh, yeah, that's the couch that was in our living room. It's worth about as much as a car, but we don't keep it in the living room because nobody respects it." And it was getting all torn up. I'm like, "Well, why is that even sitting here? Sell it."
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't get your value out of selling it as part of the inn if it's worth that much money. So manage your asset again as part of the business.
Yeah. Any other thoughts then on what innkeepers should be doing now, regardless of where they are, how far away they might be from thinking of selling or whatever? Any other thoughts on what they should really be focusing on now?
We didn't talk this area, but it's an important area to buyers and should be an important area to the current innkeepers. And that's owners' quarters. Owners' quarters are valuable when you're living there because it really is your home away from home and from the inn. It should give you peace. It should drop your blood pressure. And often it's the last thing on some innkeepers' minds. So managing a good owner's quarters. We can also say, though, that buyers really want to know where they are going to be living. So managing or creating the right space for owners is really an important piece. And it sort of drops to the bottom line, right, Chuck?
Yeah, I would say more now than even 5 or 10 years ago, the owner's quarters is a key element of what buyers look at. They want to know that, because people are more conscious now of work-life balance. And even those that have stars in their eye, still understand that at the end of the day, they need a place where they can go and disconnect from work, even for a little bit of time. And if the owner's quarters is a closet in the back of the building next to the kitchen that used to be a pantry, that dog don't hunt anymore, as we say here in Georgia. That's just not going to work. The other thing, back to your other question, in terms of things to think about as you're moving forward with your business, is recognize that the business is its own entity from an intellectual property standpoint. We run into a lot of hiccups during transition from one owner to another when people commingle their email, for example, just like the same kind of problems that we have, only different when they commingle their funds between their business and their personal finances. Keeping things separate will make transitioning ownership a lot smoother, whether it's money or intellectual property, email, guest lists, all of those things that are probably going to transfer with the business. Once they transfer from you by transferring the business, it's not yours anymore.
Your emails to your doctor shouldn't be on Innkeeper at, let's say, as an example, because they're going to be very hard to track all of those personal emails down and get them moved. Do that way ahead of time. Have a separate personal email account as just one example.
By separate email account, it needs to be really in a different domain from the inn. Anything associated with myinn.com. When I sell myinn, I sell myinn.com and all the accounts that are associated with that. What I'm not selling is my personal email at gmail.com, for example.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on those transition stories, I guess, of, oh, wow, we didn't think of this, or, as the innkeeper owner, that when it came time to transition, things got not necessarily ugly. They might have gotten, just
Messy,
frustrating,
a little messy.
or yeah, just hard to deal with. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, one thing we've learned is that as much as buyers really need to come in, and they're going to come in, and often they have about a 2-week training period with that former inn owner. It may be some before, some after, or some combination. Well, the buyer is overwhelmed. They've just spent a lot of money. They don't know what they don't know. And so they don't necessarily understand what questions to ask and what process to go through. The inn owner themselves, who just sold, have a lot to do. They're not only selling their asset, which often feels like it's selling their firstborn child. So they go through an emotional adjustment as well, but they've got a lot of physical things to take care of. They're trying to run a business, keep it a smooth transition as they're trying to move out of this business. Very difficult. I think it's challenging on both ends, and we've seen that more and more take place. So having good operational documents from the seller ahead of time, having a lot of things well written down, well ready to be able to transition so that when both are overwhelmed, and they are, and you will be at that point in time, we can help guide them through. We have a few guides, but we're not there. We're not there holding their hand through that process. So I feel for both sides on this aspect. We could go into some crazier stories on what happens either emotionally from the buyer's side or the seller's side. I've seen buyers who go in and within a very, very short period of time realize this is much harder than it seemed, and they don't really like innkeeping. So you get it all over the board. Having that in and its operations well documented and having a good training plan put together. Again, we can assist in the beginning, but they need to have that guide to go through because it's a huge process for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah. Employees. If you try to keep it a secret from your employees that you're selling the business, you are going to fail. They will find out. And I see it time and time again, sellers are afraid that if they tell their employees that they're selling the business, that the employees will leave and then they won't be able to run the business or sell it. And while that does happen sometimes because employees are human, they don't like change that they don't understand and can't control any more than anybody else does.
Right.
Manage your employees well and incentivize them to stay through the transition period. A lot of times, what I strongly recommend to sellers is that you create a retention bonus pool and tell your employees, look, if you stay with us until closing, then you're going to get, and it's usually it doesn't take a lot of money. You're going to get an extra $1,000 bonus or something like that when we sell.
Which is probably huge to them, to many early.
It's a big deal to them, but that encourages them to stay and to keep doing their job well for you. It also gives them the opportunity to impress the new owners with what good employees they are, because it's not a secret. Everybody knows when the business gets sold, all the employees are fired that day. You are now unemployed.
Technically speaking, Steve, they don't go through a firing process.
Right. Right. But I mean, they work for one company prior to, and then they're going to be working
right.
for technically
The new employer.
a different company, right?
It is.
They would hope to be working for this new company. There's no guarantees on that.
Right. That's a good point. Right.
One of the other things that I often recommend to buyers is that you also create an employee retention bonus pool so that those employees that stay over with you after the transition, after 30 days or 60 days, assuming that they keep doing their jobs well and they're a good fit, they get another $1,000. So that incentivizes them to stay through a very stressful time where the employees they're going to have to carry a little extra load because their employers don't know what they're doing. And if that process is managed well on both sides by the seller and the buyer, then the employees can have the security of continuous employment. And they know that, yes, all the rules are changing because they now have new bosses who are going to do things differently, and they need to, be allowed to do that. And I'm going to keep my job, and I'm going to be able to, eat and sleep indoors on a regular basis because that's really important to me. One of the other things that sellers need to do in that process, and this is just parenthetically, is to tell the employees, look, when we leave, we're not in charge anymore. The new owners are in charge, and you need to give them the same respect and responsiveness that you give us, or maybe even a little bit more, if you want to continue to have this job and work for these new employers. And please don't give us a phone call. Then this happened to me. Please don't give us a phone call in a month or two saying, can you believe what they did to blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I can imagine.
Anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Matt, you want to, I guess, really, I mean, we can kind of talk about where things are going or whatever, but kind of wrap it up with that.
Yeah, sounds good. Marilyn and Chuck, really appreciate your time today. And it was a good deep dive. It was fascinating. I actually learned a lot in terms of it could be for any kind of business operation or small business. Really fascinating stuff. And for our last question here, usually we ask, anything else to add, but I don't know, any new developments with your business offerings you'd like to highlight here as a parting shot? And we'll start with Marilyn.
Okay. Well, just one is that Chuck and I are fully, even though it's Marilyn Bushnell and Associates, only, again, I'm a classic old innkeeper. I've been around a long time. We're full partners in this business. And as Chuck said, he started out in the number side of the business, but he has taken the real estate classes and done enough brokerage transactions now that we're full partnerships on this. And one of the things that I would say that we're trying to do is really broaden ourselves a bit more. I've done a lot of transactions on the East Coast. I've done a number in New Mexico, but Chuck has gotten out to Oregon, to Washington State. He's headed to the Texas B&B Association meeting. So he's really branching us out a little bit deeper into some areas that we would like to assist with as well. Chuck?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that, one of the things that I realized when I joined Marilyn a couple of years ago is that I'm not aware of any bed and breakfast brokerages that are focused on B&Bs and boutique lodging. Let's call them inns because many people now get confused when you say B&B, they hear Airbnb. That's not the case, as we know, but we're not everybody else. But anyway, there aren't any brokerages that I'm aware of in the United States west of the Mississippi. And it doesn't mean that there aren't bed and breakfasts on the west of the Mississippi, but there aren't any brokers that focus on that part of the market. And so that's where I'm headed, is looking at, okay, people in Colorado, in Texas, New Mexico, the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Montana, those kind of places. I say that, and you'll notice I didn't include California. And the reason for that is because there actually are a lot of regular business brokers and real estate brokers in California that have done enough transactions for small inns where it's not a market where we focus. But hey, if somebody in Hawaii or Puerto Rico wants to sell a bed and breakfast, I'd be all over that.
Go west, Chuck.
Good deal. There we go. Go west, Chuck. Good. And we'll put information in the notes with the podcast, but contact website or whatever, Marilyn, how do people get a hold of you all?
It's pretty easy. It is MarilynBushnell.com. So just use my name as long as you can spell it. You can find us. We are in brokers, and both Chuck and I are listed there with our direct communication links as well.
Yeah, I'm actually getting a new email domain going. It's ins.forsale. So my preferred email now is chuck@ins.forsale. There's no .com or .org or anything like that after that. It's the new style URLs that are out there, just to kind of let people know what it is that we're doing and who I am.
Sounds good. All right, Matt, you going to lead us out?
Sure thing. So this concludes this Frictionless Innkeeper podcast interview with Marilyn Bushnell and Chuck Anderson of Marilyn Bushnell and Associates. And they were kind enough to share their insights into how innkeepers can enhance the value of their properties as part of their overall business strategy. And our podcast is brought to you by the Frictionless Guest App, the digital concierge that helps your guests to live like locals. Learn how at frictionlessguest.com. Once again, that's frictionlessguest.com. And Marilyn, Chuck, and Steve, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn. Thanks, Chuck. We appreciate the time.
Thank you, Steve.